All right, moving on. Our third speaker this morning is Kyle Dittmer. Mr. Dittmer earned 2 Bachelors of Science degrees from the University of Washington, one in geology and one in oceanography. Masters of Science degree in geology from Eastern Washington University near Spokane. Kyle is also a USDA certified meteorologist. He was a hydrologist for the National Weather Service in Portland for 10 years. He currently works for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission as a hydrologist meteorologist for the past 13 years. In addition, Kyle teaches evening classes in introductory meteorology and introductory oceanography at Portland Community College and is a part-time geology professor at Maryland University. Whew, that's a lot. Kyle served as president of this wonderful Oregon AMS chapter from 2005 to 2009. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Kyle Dittmer.
Okay, on to the big shoe. I remember last year I gave my presentation from Germany. We had some pretty strange weather. I was there for 2 weeks. It was partly mostly sunny, which for middle of October is extremely unusual even by German standards. So that was definitely think that our weather isn't changing here. Today I want to give an overview as far as what happened here last year as far as my forecast. And we're going this year here. As you know, I don't know how long I've been doing this, maybe 8 years or so. I'm kind of losing track. Kind of like Pete, kind of like losing mine here. As far as the forecast, last year I was saying we're going to have basically kind of a moderate start to the season here, and then going off here to perhaps colder than normal conditions late in the season. We did so, except it was a little more extreme than expected. Definitely we're off to a cold start during November, got kind of nice, somewhat warm December and January, and then turned really cold by mid to late winter. On a seasonal basis, though, it came out to about near average, which probably was my best temperature forecast on a seasonal basis ever. I was happy about that. The precip, I was saying we're going to have a good shot of moisture earlier in the season and then move towards somewhat near normal toward the end. Actually, we kind of have a double whammer. We basically have a really strong shot in December and then a really big blitz here in March. So that was definitely unusual. And the overall precip here was about perhaps maybe 9% above what I was predicting. So actually really good on the precip too. I've noticed over the years it's harder to predict precip than it is on temperature. So the fact that I was within ballpark in the precip, I felt pretty good about that. As you remember last year, as my disembodied voice from 10,000 miles away, I was talking about what snow events we were going to have here, and I was predicting 6 snow events. Of course, I could hear you folks gasp from 10,000 miles away across the Atlantic. The audio was quite good, Steve, so thanks for doing that. That was great. I was predicting 6 events between 2 to 5 inches each. From mid-December through early March. Actually, and it's interesting, Mark Nelson said we only had 2 snow events. Just based upon the snow observations at the local Portland Weather Office website here, actually I was counting 5 events. They were all light. Unfortunately, I think the biggest was maybe half an inch, but nothing of real substance here. So that was a little bit of disappointment. I was real hoping for some really good snowfall, but unfortunately that did not happen. So I counted 5 snow events. In which regard, that was my best snow forecast ever, so I was pretty happy about that. Also, because of my methodology, I also do advanced water supply forecasting here, my MEI method, which I'll explain here in a minute. I was predicting 129 million acre feet. That forecast issued last year, about 120% normal. And we came out with roughly about 143 million acre feet. That was the 4th largest runoff year of the last 100 years. So it was definitely a big year. And my error in that was plus minus 10%, and that I considered a good forecast. I also developed a new set of forecast equations going into the in-season, going into January through April for my agency, the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, which we do salmon recovery work. It's nice to know how much water is going to be in the river for little salmon to swim out to the ocean here. My first forecast this season actually was my best one, 137 million acre feet, 127% normal. That was like plus or minus 4%. It was one of my best forecasts. As far as the preseason forecast, it was the 2nd year in a row as far as actually having the best preseason forecast, which of course my competition being the National Weather Service. And by the way, my talk today, as well as the more detailed aspects of my forecast, will be online with the AMS website here, probably by tomorrow evening sometime. So that's how the forecast shaped out. I was actually pretty happy with the results here. My methodology here, I take a very big picture view about doing things. I use a variety of techniques here. I do look at solar forcing, a technique that Dr. Theodor Landscheid of Germany developed a few years ago. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, but he came up with a real intriguing view about relationship between solar activity and ENSO activity, which I'll explain here in just a minute. I look at the multivariable ENSO index. I also look at what's happening as far as our CISA for future temperature departures, courtesy here of NOAA. But I have a unique hydroclimate approach. I use a relationship between the multivariable ENSO index and the observed historical runoff of the Columbia at the Dalles here, looking at the really long-term record and developing a relationship between the two, I come up with looking at a 3-month running average of that MEI, plug into my equations, and come up with a forecasted volume. Then I look at past weather years, essentially back engineer as far as what years did it take to produce that forecast. And in this case this year, unlike until now, I artificially limited myself to 20 past weather years. This year I'm using as many as I want. This year I identified 26 years. This is what we call probabilistic or ensemble forecasting here, where you look at many different conditions, starting conditions, and you essentially can use the mean of that to give you an idea about what the expected weather patterns will be here. So in this regard here, pattern recognition, this is something that we as weather forecasters do every year. We use different tools, different methodologies, but the heart of the matter, that is really the guts of what we do as far as the long-range forecasting, as far as we look for specific patterns, whether they're repeating or not, but we have a different take on it. And this year, I heard something really interesting here from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. They came up with an in-house study that suggested that from 1900 through this last year, that there was greater than a 50% chance that there'd be a back-to-back La Nina year condition. In other words, 2 La Nina years in a row. And that really intrigued me. So part of my forecast scheme this year was looking at pairs of La Nina years. In this case here, using my record going back from the 1930s through last year, because I add previous year's data to my forecast data set here, I found 7 pairs of La Nina events. And of the 7, 3 were triple La Nina events, back to back. So that definitely weighted in my influence here as far as the forecast. So let's take a look here as far as the solar activity here, as far as the sunspot counts. What Dr. Landscheid found, that we're in a sunspot minima, we are more tending toward La Nina conditions. We're toward a sunspot maximum, we tend toward more El Nino-like conditions. Right now, but we're kind of in between the peak and the trough here, and so it's a little bit indeterminate. So I don't think the sunspot's going to play a huge role in looking at this year's particular weather patterns. Sea surface temperature forecast definitely suggests we're going to be moving into another La Nina event. That's actually been brewing here for the last several months. Now, more about this multivariable ENSO index. I really like this index for several reasons. It does incorporate the basics of ENSO as far as looking at what we call the SOI, the Southern Oscillation Index. But it does more than that. It's actually a composite index that takes a look at that difference in sea level pressure, takes a look at the surface winds across the ocean temperature, the air temperature, and the amount of sky cover, all combined into one index. So in that regard, I think it's a much more representative index as far as tracking ENSO in the Pacific. And so this is what I've used to regress against my historical Columbia Basin runoff at the Dalles to build my forecast scheme here. And the R-square values, for those of you who are statistical purists here, the R-square is about roughly 0.3. Not a strong, super strong relationship, but not weak either. And definitely becomes more robust each year as I add that data back into my forecast database there. The Pacific decadal oscillation signal has been very, very favorable. It's interesting, if you look at our signal we've had here the last few months, looking very reminiscent here to what we had here the months leading up here to December 2008. Very negative, very cold. And so we're actually seeing a repeat of history here. So the PDO suggests we're going to see some interesting and colder weather this year. This is the guts of my forecast here as far as that doing that and seeing. This is actually all of my 26 water years here. And the blue line indicates the really long-term average going back from 1929, the first year of my data set here, to 2011. The red line is my expected flow forecast here. And I'll bring attention here to the June point here. The flow here is 550,000 CFS. As the unregulated flow is actually bankful and flood stage down here at the Vancouver and Portland harbors. So this last year we actually saw a flood flow at Vancouver. We could perhaps maybe see a repeat condition of that. So what I did here in the forecast, I took a look at the volume here from January through July, and I back calculated looking at these specific weather years that actually would produce that volume here. And so here's what I came up with here for my forecast here as far as using that 26-year average here. For the first part of the season here, at least for November, December, will be a little bit, actually all near normal temperatures, but a little bit on the warmer side here for November and December. A little bit toward the cool side here for January, February, and March. But take note here in March here, it looks like we could get a really cold blast of late winter weather, which is not unheard of for both ENSO neutral and La Nina years. As far as the precipitation here, it actually really mirrors more, which I was surprised, what we saw observed last year from Mark Nelson's presentation. Basically, we got a really good blast of moisture early in the season, it was a little bit quiet mid-season, and then turned on the faucet again by late season. So here I'm showing about 113% normal for November, 124% here for December, just slightly above normal for January and February, but then we get back to March again about 111% of normal. So in general here, probably about maybe a little bit slightly below normal temperature-wise for the season, and generally above normal precipitation. As far as the variability in the weather, it has been noted over the years that when you're looking at El Nino years, La Nina, and ENSO neutral, is that the ENSO neutral years, which is the third phase of ENSO, you can actually have a lot of extreme variability in the weather, in which case you could also have snow events. It can also happen here with La Nina. Here we're really looking at a situation, it's kind of borderline slightly on the La Nina side, but still has some characteristics of ENSO neutral, which basically means we could stand a good chance of some highly variable weather here. So I'm looking at heavy rain events, maybe not necessarily Pineapple Express, but also local flood events, probably maybe 1 or 2 Arctic blasts and some high winds. So I think we'll kind of have some of the variability of like an ENSO neutral winter, but also combined with the classic characteristics of La Nina. So in other words, kind of the best of all worlds, if you're really into really severe weather and all sorts of fire and brimstone. This is really great stuff here. As far as the water supply forecast, right now I'm looking for about 117 million acre-feet a year, about 109%. This would be equivalent to what we saw here in 2006. That was an ENSO neutral year. We actually had some pretty good runoff here that year. So it was good water supply for everyone, the irrigators, the hydropower people, the fish. It was a good year. Last year was a great year for everyone, especially for the fish. It was one of the best runoff years we've had since 1997, so that's really, really great news for our endangered salmon here. What you probably want to know here, what about snow events? Everyone's come here and wants to know about snow, the big S word here. Well, remember last year I said 6 events, I could hear you gasping from 10,000 miles away, so I can actually see your reaction now to, I think based upon the data I'm seeing here, I think we're going to expect here 3 events here this year. I'm thinking 2 and 3 events will be minor ones, maybe about like 1 inch or less. One of them I think I'll call the Big Whopper, a 5-inch event. We haven't seen a Big Whopper in several years. I'm not really counting December 2008, because that basically was like one big snowstorm lasted for 10 days. I'm thinking more like about 2000 and 2002 and 3, and back in those times, we haven't seen a really good singular dump in a long time. I think we're overdue for that here. The statistical likelihood here is between 88 to 92%, with that 92% actually following February. So keep an eye on February this year. 88% is really looking here in January. So I'm thinking January is more likely. We'll probably, actually January and the first half of February, I think we're more likely to see the snow dumpings around here. So 3 events, I think that is reasonable. So I'll leave you here with the cliffhanger here. Will we see the 5-inch Big Whopper, or will we see the snow apocalypse? Woo! Thank you.